So this video focuses on alternatives to the overlocking finish on the edge of your fabric. So the overlocking finish is good for preventing your fabric from fraying, and it's used in many places on the inside of the garment to finish it, and so that in its wear and in its washing that the fabric doesn't fray. It's kind of contained in the overlocking stitch. So if you find yourself at home and you don't have an overlocker, there are several alternatives. The first one, if you had a pinking shears, which is a scissors that looks like this, that has the zigzaggy edge, you can cut the edge of the fabric along and get this style of finish. Now this is not a very professional finish. It tends to be associated with homemade crafty garments. However, if you were stuck in a particular situation where you had no other alternative and you did have one of these tools handy, it is better than just leaving the edge. Our second option is to do a zigzag stitch down along the edge of the fabric. So this will also help prevent the fabric from fraying. What you would need to do to create this zigzag stitch would be to find the stitch width knob or dial on your machine. Each machine is different, so you may need to refer to your manual to find where on your particular machine is the option to create a zigzag stitch. So on this Bernina machine, the stitch width is this here, this dial here. You can see there's numbers, and we can choose how wide we want our stitching to be. So we can go all the way to the widest stitch width. You can go a little bit down and be slightly narrower. So I'm going to go to the widest one as an example. Also, you need to look at your stitch length. So this will determine how close the zigzag stitches are together, and you'll need to determine that. You might need to do a few practices to find the optimal stitch width and length for your zigzag stitch. So I'm going to place this down here. So you're going on the edge of the fabric. The better thing to do is go in slightly in from the edge, do your zigzag, and then cut off the excess after, as if you try and stitch on the exact edge of the fabric. The fabric kind of gets eaten up by the machine and it tends to get stuck. So you're better off just go a tiny bit in, do your zigzag, and then sliver off the millimeter or two with your scissors after. So I've got it on 5, and I've got it on the kind of regular 2.5 stitch length. So we'll see what that looks like. Probably wide. I could go a bit. So sometimes when you're stitching with just one layer of fabric, the machine doesn't like it. It creates tension, and you need to loosen your tension on the machine so that the tension will be not pulling and the fabric into a little tuck. So just loosen the tension there. So there we have our zigzag stitch. So you can see what's happened there. It's pulled the fabric in, so there is a bit of tension in there. So this is what is the challenge of the zigzag stitch. It does not like the machine doesn't like to be stitching one layer of fabric. So you can see that it improved there in the section where I loosened the tension on the machine, so all of a sudden it sat flat. So the tension dial is here. The red was the optimal, and I moved it down a little bit. So again, if you were on your machine at home, you'd have to find your tension dial or knob and go closer to 0. So when the zigzag is complete, you can then cut the little bit of the edge of the remaining fabric off, so that now the zigzag stitching is coming and meeting the edge of the fabric. So that is your second option for finishing the edges of your fabric. And again, the left hand side here with the flatter finish is optimal. Third alternative to an overlocking finish on your edge of the fabric is a clean finish. So clean finish is where the edge of your fabric is turned under slightly, well, I suppose maybe about 0.5 centimeters, and pressed. So you can measure that along. If you can do, I suppose, less, maybe 0.4 millimeters or 0.3 millimeters, then that's good. But what you want to do is make sure that it's all even. So we're just going to sew our clean edge finish. Now with the calico, the fabric is actually staying back by itself just from being pressed, but a lot of fabrics you know, wouldn't cooperate so much, so you might have to pin them. It can be hard to pin such a small piece that's folded back, but I would still recommend pinning it in the perpendicular direction to what you're going to be sewing, so that you can take the pins out easily. So there we have it, ready to go, turned under slightly. So we line it up now and we're just stitching along. Just about 3 or 4 millimeters in. So there you have the clean edge finish with the stitching along. So it leaves a nice finish at the edge, and you can find this maybe on the edge of facings. You can also, when you have a regular open seam, you can actually do this finish on both sides of the seam. The fourth alternative to an overlocked edge for your fabric would be a bias bound edge. So I have some bias binding here, some narrow bias binding. And what I'm going to do is fold that in half and press it along. It's already been pre-pressed, but just to give you the idea. So here we can place this bias binding around the edge of that seam, and we call this kind of sandwiching. So you kind of have your bias binding and the fabric and you're sandwiching it between, and we can pin all along there and stitch along the edge. So here we have the bias binding pinned into place and ready to sew. So we just need to stitch on the edge of the bias binding. We need to be sure that when we're stitching on the edge of it, that we're also catching the layer underneath. So to be on the safe side, you want to be like a millimeter in from the edge. Just be sure and catch the other side. So there you have the bias binding stitched on. You can also have this done on each side of a seam. So if you have an open seam and you have one side and the other side, it can look like that, and you can have the bias binding on each side of it. So here are the 4 alternatives to an overlocked edge. So you have your pinking shears there as option 1, but definitely a less professional finish. You have your zigzag stitch here. Just be sure that you loosen the tension on your machine, otherwise you'll get this tucking. Nice, and make sure that it's nice and flat. You have your clean finish where you've turned under the edge and stitched along, or you have your bias bound finish where you've sandwiched on some small bias binding and stitched it on. This is also known as a Hong Kong finish. Further alternatives to the overlocking edge finish. So that would relate to seams. So if you have a seam, you could French seam it, or you could welt seam it, but it would depend on the fabric and the style of the garment whether that would be appropriate. Both the French and the welt seam incorporate the edges of the fabric so that they won't fray, so they're also good alternatives to the overlock finish.